The night was quiet, too quiet. A thin mist hung low over the small suburban neighborhood, wrapping the houses in an eerie stillness. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still carried the dampness of an unfinished storm. Streetlights flickered at irregular intervals, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. The kind of night where something could happen and no one would notice. Somewhere, in one of these houses, a woman was taking her final breath. A series of muffled pops shattered the silence. Quick, precise, deliberate. Not the loud cracks of fireworks, nor the chaotic bursts of a struggle. These were controlled. 9 gunshots, fired in succession. A methodical act of violence, hidden beneath the cloak of midnight. Then nothing. The house returned to silence. The world outside remained undisturbed. No one screamed. No one called for help. The morning brought routine. Neighbors started their day, unaware that behind one closed door, life had already ended. Betty Jean Solomon had always been an early riser. Her neighbors knew her as a friendly but private woman, one who maintained a structured life. She left for work at the same time every morning. The sight of her car still parked outside, well past her usual departure time, was the first sign that something was wrong. It was Eleanor Watkins who noticed. She lived across the street and had a habit of glancing out her window while making her morning coffee. At first, she thought nothing of it. People overslept, had sick days, changed their routines. But something gnawed at her. The curtains were drawn. The house was still. Betty Jean's home had always felt warm, lived in. But today there was an emptiness to it. Eleanor stepped outside, her slippers barely making a sound on the cold pavement. She hesitated for a moment before crossing the street, walking up to the front door. She knocked. Once, twice. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. A wave of unease settled over her. This wasn't right. She pulled out her phone and called 911. The first officers arrived within minutes. Sergeant Michael Davies was the first to approach the door. A seasoned officer, he had seen enough in his career to know when something wasn't right. The house wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. No movement, no response, no sound of morning routines. He tested the doorknob. Locked. With permission from the landlord, the officers forced their way inside. The smell of dried blood hit them immediately. There, in the living room, lay Betty Jean Solomon. Her body was crumpled on the floor, lifeless, the deep red of her blood stark against the beige carpet. She had been shot multiple times, chest, back, arms. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. It was as if she had opened the door to her killer, let them in willingly. Whoever had done this had wanted her dead, not just to eliminate, but to ensure there was no chance of survival. 9 bullets, overkill. Yet nothing else was touched. Her purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter. The television remote remained neatly placed on the coffee table. Her jewelry, valuable enough to tempt an opportunistic thief, remained where it was. This was no robbery. This was something far more personal. The investigation began immediately. Detectives arrived, marking off the crime scene, photographing every inch of the room. Forensic specialists swarmed the house, dusting for prints, collecting fibers, searching for the story hidden in blood spatter patterns. The first question was always the same. Who had the motive? By all accounts, Betty Jean had no enemies. A quiet, responsible woman with a stable job and a husband who was about to receive the worst phone call of his life. Paul Solomon was contacted that morning. His reaction was immediate. He rushed to the station, grief-stricken, demanding answers. Detectives had questions too. Where were you last night? Paul swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he wiped at his face. At a bar, he said, voice shaking. With coworkers. Can anyone confirm that? He nodded. Yes. I wasn't home. I didn't. His breath hitched, his hands balling into fists. I didn't even know until you called. His alibi was solid. Witnesses placed him at the bar during the estimated time of death. But something was off. Through all his tears, all his shock, Paul never asked how Betty Jean had died, never asked who had done it. That was unusual. People, when confronted with tragedy, usually demanded answers. They wanted to know what had happened, who was responsible, but Paul's only response was grief. No curiosity. It was a small detail, but detectives had learned over the years that small details mattered. Still, he had an alibi. If it wasn't him, then who? A name surfaced almost immediately. While going through Paul's phone records, investigators found a number that had been dialed repeatedly. Calls in the evening. Calls late at night. Calls on the morning after Betty Jean was murdered. The number belonged to a woman named Carolyn Warmus, a name the detectives would soon hear over and over again. A funeral home silence filled the police station. The air was thick, suffocating, the kind of silence that preceded something grim. In one of the interrogation rooms, Paul Solomon sat hunched over the cold metal table, his hands clasped together as if he were holding something fragile. The weight of his grief was palpable, yet there was something about his presence that didn't quite fit. It wasn't just grief. It was something deeper, something unreadable. Detective Mark O'Connor studied him through the one-way mirror. He had seen all kinds of grief before. The raw, uncontrollable kind, the numb, dissociated kind, the staged for the camera kind. And then there was this, the kind that sat between guilt and fear, the kind that made a man look down at his hands too often, as if expecting to see something on them. Paul's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. How? How did she die? A question that should have come sooner. The detective leaned in. She was shot multiple times in her own home. There was no sign of forced entry. He watched Paul's face closely. The man exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers to his temples. It wasn't quite shock. It wasn't quite denial. Paul swallowed. She was alone? O'Connor nodded. Paul's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His breathing became uneven, and for a moment it seemed like he was trying to suppress something. Panic, maybe. But why panic? His alibi had been checked. He wasn't there when it happened. So why did he look like a man realizing the walls were closing in? O'Connor took out a small notepad, flipping to the call logs retrieved from Paul's phone. You made multiple calls last night. He let the words settle before continuing. And again this morning, all to the same number. Paul's fingers curled into his palms. Who? His voice cracked slightly. The detective tapped his pen against the paper. Carolyn Warmus. The name echoed through the room like an unanswered question. Carolyn Warmus. At first glance, there was nothing inherently suspicious about her. A 20-something schoolteacher with blonde hair and a smile that disarmed people too easily. She had money. She had charm. She had an ease about her that made people lower their guard. But something wasn't right. Carolyn wasn't just a colleague. She wasn't just a casual acquaintance. She was something much more. Paul had tried to downplay it at first. She's just someone I know. But detectives had heard that before. Just someone. A phrase men used when they wanted to downplay something dangerous, something that had gotten out of control. It hadn't taken long for investigators to start connecting the dots. Paul had been calling Carolyn frequently in the weeks leading up to the murder. Late at night, early in the morning, calls that were too frequent, too intentional to be harmless. And then there was the morning after the murder. Paul had called Carolyn again, before calling anyone else, before calling the police, before even calling a family member. O'Connor leaned forward. Tell me about Carolyn. Paul hesitated. He stared at his hands for a long moment, as if debating whether to tell the truth or continue the performance of a grieving husband. Then finally he exhaled. He rubbed his face. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. That was how it always started. She liked me. I won't lie. We had an affair. It was... His voice trailed off. The detective didn't interrupt. He let the silence do the work. Paul inhaled sharply, gripping his forehead as if it physically pained him to say the next words. She got attached. Too attached. That, too, was something detectives had heard before. It was always just an affair, until it wasn't. Carolyn Warmus had come from wealth. Her father was a powerful businessman, and she had never known what it was like to want for anything. She carried herself with confidence, the kind that people mistook for charm, but in reality was something more calculated. People liked her because they had no reason not to, But beneath the polished exterior was a woman who didn't take rejection well. Friends and colleagues later described her as someone who needed to be wanted. That was how they put it, delicately, as if saying it outright would invite something darker into the conversation. She had become obsessed with Paul. She called him constantly. She showed up unexpectedly. She sent letters, messages, gifts. At first, Paul had been flattered. Then he had been uncomfortable. Then finally, he had been afraid. She started talking about Betty Jean, Paul admitted, voice low. Started asking about our marriage, our problems. And then one day he shook his head. She said something that scared me. O'Connor's grip on his pen tightened. What did she say? Paul hesitated. His mouth opened slightly, but then he clamped it shut. Something had changed in his face. Something that made the detective realize Paul wasn't telling them everything. But whether it was guilt or fear keeping him silent, that was still unclear. As the hours passed, the case became more tangled. Carolyn Warmus wasn't just a school teacher. She wasn't just a woman who had fallen for the wrong man. She was something more. A neighbor came forward saying they had seen someone near Betty Jean's home on the night of the murder. A woman, blonde, but it was dark. They couldn't be sure. And then there was the question of the gun. Betty Jean had been shot multiple times, but the weapon was missing. The police had no murder weapon, no fingerprints, no clear motive. But they had something better. They had a woman scorned. And sometimes that was all it took. The crime scene had settled into an eerie stillness. The flashing red and blue lights from patrol cars reflected off the wet pavement, painting the night in flickering shades of urgency. Inside the small suburban home, investigators moved deliberately, their gloved hands careful not to disturb any potential evidence. The house itself was silent, yet the remnants of what had happened hours earlier lingered like an unspoken warning. Betty Jean Solomon's body had been removed, but the evidence of her final moments remained. The blood had dried in uneven patches across the carpet, marking the places where her body had fallen, shifted. 9 gunshots. The sheer number of wounds made the act feel more personal than random. A single shot could have killed her. But this was something else entirely. Whoever had pulled the trigger had meant for her to die. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. Each shot had been fired with precision, ensuring there was no chance of survival. And yet, despite the violence, the rest of the house remained eerily untouched. No overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle, no broken glass. Nothing was missing, not a single valuable had been taken. Whoever had done this had walked into that house knowing exactly what they were there to do. Investigators were left with a haunting question. Had Betty Jean known her killer? Had she opened the door willingly, unaware that it would be the last thing she ever did? The body was taken to the morgue, where forensic pathologists began their work. Under the bright surgical lights, the truth began to take shape. The bullets had entered her body in a controlled pattern, some striking her in the back, others hitting her as she turned. Defensive wounds were absent, no bruising, no scratches, no signs of resistance. She had not fought. Either she had been caught off guard, or she had not seen it coming at all. The fatal wound had been a shot to the chest. Even if she had survived the initial impact, the sheer number of wounds meant she had no chance. Death had been nearly instant. Detectives gathered around a preliminary report. A .25 caliber handgun had been used, a small weapon, often chosen for its concealability, not for its power. It was an assassin's gun, something meant for close-range, precise kills. The pattern suggested the shooter had not fired in panic. Each bullet had been placed with a steady hand, and the gun was missing. A homicide without a murder weapon made things significantly more difficult. If the shooter had left the gun behind, it could have been traced, registered, connected to a store, a name, a person. But the absence of the weapon suggested an experienced mind. This wasn't someone who had killed in blind rage and fled in terror. This was someone who had planned ahead, who had known exactly what to do afterward. The search for the missing weapon began immediately. Officers combed the surrounding area, looking through bushes, dumpsters, storm drains, anywhere a panicked killer might have disposed of a gun. But the weapon was nowhere to be found. The evidence suggested that the killer had taken it with them. That meant this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It wasn't an act of random violence. This was personal. As investigators worked through the crime scene, a knock on a neighbor's door revealed something that would shift the focus of the case. Mrs. Ferris, an elderly woman who lived nearby, hesitated when asked if she had seen anything suspicious. Then after a long pause, she spoke. "I saw someone outside," she said. "A woman, blonde." The detective's pen stopped. "What time was this?" She frowned, trying to remember. "I don't know, late. I couldn't sleep. I looked out my window and saw someone near the house, but she walked away before I could get a good look." The air in the room grew heavier. Blonde hair. There was one name on the list of persons of interest that now seemed more pressing than ever. Carolyn Warmus. The first time detectives had heard the name, it had been buried in Paul Solomon's phone records. Just a name, a contact, a number that had been dialed again and again, before and after Betty Jean's murder. Now that name had weight. Carolyn was not just a colleague of Paul Solomon. She was more than that. The affair between them was not just casual. It had been obsessive, erratic, something that Paul himself had grown wary of. When detectives first asked him about her, he had been careful with his words. "She's someone I know," he had said. "Not a friend, not a girlfriend, just someone." And that was where the story had begun to crack. Paul and Carolyn had met at work, and from the beginning, she had admired him in a way that went beyond professional respect. She was younger, charismatic, the kind of person people gravitated toward. But her attachment to Paul had gone beyond the lines of a simple relationship. She called him constantly. She sent messages at all hours. She appeared in places she wasn't expected. And then she had started talking about Betty Jean, asking questions. Too many questions. Paul had admitted this much to detectives, though he had hesitated when asked for specifics. She became too attached," he had said. "What do you mean by that?" He had taken a breath before answering. "She talked about my wife too much, about how unhappy I was, about how things would be easier if Betty Jean wasn't around." A silence had followed those words. Now, with a neighbor placing a blonde woman near the home at the time of the murder, Carolyn's name could no longer be ignored. Investigators turned their attention to her. They looked into her background, her past, her behaviors. What they found only deepened their suspicions. Carolyn Warmus had grown up wealthy. Her father was powerful, well-connected. She had never been told no. Everything she wanted, she got. She wasn't the kind of woman who accepted rejection. As detectives examined her past, they began to see patterns. Relationships that had gone too far, attachments that had turned possessive, warnings that had been ignored. And now there was a dead woman, the missing gun, the calls to Paul Solomon, the blonde woman seen near the crime scene. The pieces were beginning to take shape, but they weren't there yet. There was still the question of the weapon, the missing link, the thing that would turn suspicion into certainty. And detectives were about to find out just how much Carolyn Warmus was willing to hide. The case had started as a brutal but straightforward homicide. A woman gunned down in her own home. No sign of forced entry, no theft, no struggle. But as investigators dug deeper, they found themselves entangled in something far more insidious. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was something calculated, planned. A crime that had been conceived long before the trigger was ever pulled. And now, as the investigation turned toward one woman, a woman whose presence lingered at the edges of every lead, they found themselves staring into the kind of obsession that didn't just burn hot, it consumed. Her name was Carolyn Warmus. The first time Carolyn's name had appeared in the investigation, it had been a whisper, a phone number dialed too many times, a passing mention in an interview, a face in the background of Paul Solomon's life. But now she was at the center of everything. She wasn't a casual acquaintance. She wasn't just someone Paul had met in passing. She was a woman who had made herself indispensable to him, and she wasn't taking no for an answer. Detectives started with the basics. Who was Carolyn Warmus? Her past was polished, almost too perfect. Born into privilege, she had grown up in a world where everything was handed to her. Her father was wealthy, powerful, the kind of man who made problems disappear with a phone call. Carolyn had been given the best. Elite schools, a comfortable life, the promise of success, but there was something off beneath the surface. People who had known her described her as magnetic, intelligent, charming, but also intense. Relationships didn't just happen for her. They were pursued, possessed. And when they ended, they didn't just dissolve. They imploded. One former friend recalled how Carolyn had once fixated on a man in college, convinced that he was the one, despite the fact that he barely knew her. She left notes in his locker, waited outside his dorm, showed up at places she shouldn't have known he would be. When he rejected her, she didn't take it lightly. She called his new girlfriend in the middle of the night. She sent letters that grew more desperate, then more threatening. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. She moved on. To someone new. The pattern repeated. Fixation, possession, collapse. But this time, with Paul Solomon, it had gone further. Carolyn had met Paul at the school where they both taught. He was older, experienced, charming in a way that made younger women look at him twice. She was young, ambitious, the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. At first it was subtle, an admiration, a closeness that developed in quiet moments, a lingering conversation after class, a shared joke in the break room, the small touches that meant nothing until they meant everything. Then it became something more. Paul was flattered. He was married, but the attention from someone younger, someone who made him feel wanted, was intoxicating. For Carolyn, it was never just an affair. It was possession. She didn't want to be a secret. She wanted to be the only one. She asked about his marriage, his wife, his home. She wanted to know everything. And the more Paul hesitated, the more Carolyn pushed. Until finally, she said something that made him uneasy. "She's in the way." That was the moment Paul realized he was losing control. He had wanted excitement, an escape from his routine. But this wasn't fun anymore. Carolyn wasn't just a woman having an affair. She was something else, something unpredictable. She started showing up unannounced, at his house, at places he hadn't told her he would be. One night, Betty Jean mentioned that she had a strange feeling, like she was being watched. She brushed it off as paranoia. But was it paranoia, or had Carolyn already been there, lurking just beyond the edges of their life, waiting for her moment? The investigation into Carolyn intensified. Detectives examined her phone records, her whereabouts, her actions leading up to and following Betty Jones' murder. Then they found something chilling. Carolyn had been asking about guns. She had spoken to a private investigator, a man named Vincent Parco. He wasn't the kind of PI who followed cheating spouses with a camera. He was the kind of man you called when you needed problem solved. Parco told detectives that Carolyn had asked about buying a gun. Not just any gun, a .25 caliber handgun, the same kind used to kill Betty Jean Solomon. Carolyn had also been reading about crime scenes, asking questions about how investigations worked, how police found suspects, how they traced weapons. And then, after the murder, she had been too calm. She didn't call Paul in panic. She called him as if she already knew what had happened. The net was closing. Carolyn Warmus had gone from a name in a phone log to the most important piece of the puzzle, the missing murder weapon, the woman seen near Betty Jean's home, the obsession with Paul Solomon. It was all lining up. Detectives weren't just looking at a love triangle anymore. They were looking at a premeditated act of violence. And they were about to find out just how deep Carolyn's obsession truly ran. The deeper investigators dug, the more the story twisted into something sinister. The murder of Betty Jones Solomon had begun as a puzzle, one with too many missing pieces. But with each step, the image was becoming clearer. What had first appeared to be a tragic but straightforward homicide was now revealing itself as a crime fueled by obsession, by control, by something far darker than jealousy alone. The person at the center of this tangled web? Carolyn Warmus. Her name had been nothing more than a detail at the start. An entry in Paul Solomon's phone records, a colleague with a questionable relationship. But now her presence in his life loomed over the investigation like a shadow, stretching farther than anyone had initially realized. Carolyn wasn't just part of Paul's life. She had inserted herself into it. She had studied it, memorized it, rewritten her own role in it until she was convinced that there was no space for anyone else, including Betty Jean. The detectives knew they had to build their case piece by piece. They had to follow the trail Carolyn had left behind, not just in the days leading up to the murder, but in the months before, perhaps even longer. One of the first things they did was return to the phone records. Carolyn's calls to Paul hadn't been just frequent. They had been relentless. There were hundreds of them, some lasting seconds, some stretching into the early hours of the morning. She had called him before the murder. She had called him after the murder. But there was something chilling about the morning Betty Jean's body was found. Before Paul had even learned his wife was dead, before the police had contacted him, Carolyn had already called him, multiple times. It was as if she had been waiting for something. And when Paul finally picked up, she hadn't sounded surprised. She had sounded calm. Investigators knew this was significant, but without more, it was still just circumstantial evidence. They needed something stronger, something undeniable. They turned to Carolyn's movements on the night of the murder. At first, it seemed like she had no clear alibi. She had told friends she was out late but hadn't been specific. She had no receipts, no timestamps, no one who could confirm her whereabouts. Then there was the neighbor's testimony. Mrs. Ferris, the elderly woman who had seen a blonde figure outside the Solomon home, had hesitated when first questioned. But when detectives pressed her for details, something clicked. The hair, she said. It was long, straight, blonde. Carolyn Warmus had long, straight blonde hair. It still wasn't proof, but it was a crack in the foundation of her story. Then came the most disturbing lead yet, the gun. Detectives had spent weeks searching for the murder weapon. It had never turned up in a trash bin, a nearby river, or any of the usual places a panicked killer might have discarded it. Because whoever had killed Betty Jean hadn't panicked. They had planned. That was when police received an anonymous tip about a private investigator named Vincent Parco. Parco wasn't a household name, but in certain circles, he was known for handling problems that didn't always align with the law. He was the type of man you went to if you wanted to know how to make something disappear. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he didn't deny knowing Carolyn. In fact, he was remarkably open about it. "She came to me," he said, "wanted a gun." The room went still. Parco described how Carolyn had been curious, not just about guns, but about how crimes were investigated. She wanted to know how cops track things, what they look for, how they find suspects. That detail sent a chill down the investigators' spines. Most people who wanted a gun didn't ask those kinds of questions. Carolyn Warmus hadn't been looking for protection. She had been looking for information. And then Parco delivered the final blow. He had sold her a .25 caliber handgun, the same type of weapon that had killed Betty Jean Solomon. The case against Carolyn was tightening. The phone calls, the lack of an alibi, the neighbor's testimony, the gun. It was all pointing in the same direction, but detectives knew they weren't done yet. They needed more. They needed irrefutable proof. That was when they decided to search Carolyn's belongings. They had expected to find something, maybe a trace of gunpowder, maybe receipts, maybe a hidden note. What they found was worse. Buried in her belongings was a journal, and inside it were pages filled with Paul's name. Over and over. Paul, Paul, Paul. Some entries were love letters, written with the intensity of someone who refused to believe she wasn't the center of his world. Others were darker. "She's in the way. She doesn't deserve him. I would be better for him." They weren't just thoughts. They were promises. The journal was a blueprint for a mind unraveling. It was the missing piece, the thing that took Carolyn from a woman in love to a woman willing to do anything. And now detectives knew it was time to bring her in. Carolyn Warmus had spent her life slipping through cracks, navigating the world with an ease that only came to those who had never faced true consequences. She had grown up in privilege, surrounded by wealth and power, protected from failure by the sheer force of her father's influence. If something didn't go her way, it was fixed. If she wanted something, she got it. If a problem arose, it was handled. But this was different. There were no strings to pull, no favors to call in. No amount of charm or carefully crafted smiles could undo what was happening now. Because now she wasn't just someone Paul Solomon had slept with. She was the woman detectives believed had murdered his wife. And for the first time, She was running out of ways to pretend otherwise. The evidence against her was growing by the hour. The phone calls, the missing alibi, the blonde figure near the house, the private investigator who had sold her the same type of gun used in the murder. And then, the most damning discovery yet, her journal, pages filled with obsessive ramblings about Paul, about Betty Jean, about how things would be easier if his wife were gone. Detectives knew they had enough to bring her in, but they weren't interested in a rushed arrest. They wanted something airtight, something that couldn't be undone in a courtroom filled with high-powered attorneys. They wanted her to unravel. They wanted to watch as the cracks began to show. So they started slow. They followed her. They watched her. And they waited. Carolyn had no idea how close they were. At first, she went about her days as if nothing had changed. She still showed up at work, still smiled at colleagues, still acted like a woman with nothing to hide. But something was different. She wasn't calling Paul as much anymore. The phone that had once been a lifeline between them had gone silent. He had stopped answering, stopped returning her messages, stopped pretending. The moment detectives had approached Paul again, shown him the journal, the gun purchase, the unsettling patterns in Carolyn's behavior, his entire demeanor had shifted. He wasn't protecting her anymore. He was distancing himself. And Carolyn, she was starting to feel it. For the first time since this all began, she was alone. It didn't take long for the stress to start showing. She became more paranoid, more erratic. She called friends in the middle of the night, sometimes crying, sometimes seething. She told one person that she felt like she was being watched. She wasn't wrong. The detectives had made sure of that. Her movements were tracked, her habits documented. Every misstep, every nervous glance over her shoulder, every too long pause before answering a question, it was all recorded, all studied. And then, the moment they had been waiting for, the first real crack. It happened late one night when she thought no one was looking. She had been drinking, too much, too fast. She left her apartment and drove aimlessly, her car cutting through the empty streets like a restless shadow. The surveillance team followed, keeping their distance, waiting to see where she would go. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, she drove to Paul Solomon's house. She didn't knock. She just sat there, staring at his home, the dim glow of the living room window, the only sign of life inside. She sat for hours, just watching, just waiting. And then finally Paul came to the window. He saw her, and he turned off the light. That was when Carolyn lost it. She stepped out of the car, staggered slightly, her movements frantic. She stood on the sidewalk, eyes locked on his house, her breathing uneven. The surveillance team kept their distance, cameras rolling, microphones catching every frantic word as she muttered to herself. He doesn't love me anymore. She ruined everything. Why doesn't he see? Then just as quickly as the outburst had started, she was back in her car. And she was gone. By morning, detectives had what they needed. Carolyn Warmus wasn't just a suspect anymore. She was unstable, and that made her dangerous. The decision was made. It was time to bring her in. Interrogations were never like what people saw in movies. There was no immediate confession, no dramatic breakdown. It was a slow war of attrition, a test of endurance between investigators who knew they had their suspect and a suspect who believed, sometimes naively, sometimes stubbornly, that they could still talk their way out of it. Carolyn Warmus had walked into the room with that belief, the carefully curated confidence of a woman who had spent her life sidestepping consequences. But the walls were closing in. For days, detectives had been watching her unravel. The woman who had once been poised, self-assured, effortlessly weaving her way into Paul Solomon's life, was now fraying at the edges. Her movements had become erratic, her calls to Paul desperate. Surveillance teams had documented it all. The long drives to nowhere, the nights spent sitting outside Paul's home, the growing paranoia in her eyes whenever she glanced over her shoulder. She knew she was being watched. She just didn't know how much they had. That was about to change. When detectives brought her in, they didn't start with accusations. They didn't need to. They had already spent weeks building their case, collecting the kind of evidence that didn't need embellishment. Instead, they started with something simple. They showed her the phone records. The calls that had started as flirtations and escalated into an obsession, the ones before the murder, where she had tried to convince Paul that his marriage was suffocating him, that Betty Jean didn't understand him, that she was the one who truly loved him. The ones after the murder, where she had dialed his number before he had even known his wife was dead. Carolyn barely reacted. She traced the edge of the table with her fingertips, silent, composed. Then they moved to the gun. She had been careful up until now, never leaving a direct paper trail that linked her to the crime, but she hadn't expected Vincent Parco to talk. She hadn't considered that the private investigator she had hired, the one who had discreetly supplied her with a .25 caliber handgun, might one day sit in that very same room and give her up without a second thought. "You purchased a gun," one of the detectives said. "Same caliber as the one used to kill Betty Jean Solomon." Carolyn blinked, her only real reaction a brief flicker in her gaze before she steadied herself. "I don't own a gun," she said smoothly. She thought that was enough. It wasn't, because the next thing detectives placed on the table wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was something far more damning. It was the journal. It wasn't just a diary of emotions. It was a roadmap of obsession. Paul's name appeared over and over, scribbled into margins, written in looping letters, some entries filled with desperate longing, others edged with something sharper, something dangerous. "She's in the way. He belongs with me. If she were gone, everything would be perfect." Carolyn inhaled sharply, a fraction too fast, her fingers clenching the armrest of her chair before she quickly relaxed them again. They had finally touched the nerve they were looking for. There was an art to an interrogation. It wasn't just about what was said, it was about how it was said, about watching the spaces between words, the tightening of a suspect's jaw, the way their eyes flickered toward the door when they felt cornered. Carolyn had entered that room believing she could control the narrative. She had spent years perfecting the art of charm, of persuasion, of convincing people to see her the way she wanted to be seen. But charm didn't work here. Not when the truth was pushing up through the cracks. Detectives pressed forward, their voices measured but firm, refusing to give her the space to breathe, to compose herself, to retreat behind carefully rehearsed lines. They laid out everything: the neighbor's sighting of a blonde woman outside Betty Jean's home, the missing alibi, the frantic phone calls to Paul in the days leading up to the murder, the carefully curated attempts to insert herself into his life at the exact moment his wife was being erased. Carolyn held her silence. Then slowly she exhaled, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe the absurdity of what she was hearing. "This is ridiculous," she said finally. "You're making up a story that doesn't exist." It was an attempt at control, but it lacked conviction, because what detectives knew, and what Carolyn was beginning to realize, was that this story did exist, and she was at the center of it. The thing about interrogations was that they weren't about getting the truth all at once. They were about weakening the defense, about making a suspect realize that the walls around them weren't as solid as they thought. Carolyn's mask didn't shatter that day, but it cracked. She refused to confess. She refused to acknowledge the weight of the evidence pressing against her, but she didn't walk out of that room the same way she had walked in. Because when detectives finally stepped away, leaving her alone in that cold, silent space, she didn't look defiant. She looked afraid. And for the first time, she understood. This wasn't going away. They weren't going away. The truth was closing in, and soon there would be nowhere left to run. Interrogations were battles of endurance, and detectives knew this one wasn't going to be won in a single sitting. Carolyn Warmus wasn't the type to buckle under immediate pressure. She had spent years molding herself into the kind of person who didn't flinch, who didn't break character, who knew how to tell a story and make people believe it. But this wasn't about charm anymore. This was about murder, and charm had a way of falling apart under the weight of undeniable evidence. The first interrogation had been a strategic opening move, a chance to confront her with the truth, to watch her reactions, to see which accusations made her deflect and which made her stiffen. She had denied everything, of course. She had dismissed their theory as ridiculous, had scoffed at the idea that she could be involved, had tried to pretend the journal, the phone records, the witness statements meant nothing, but her body had told a different story. It wasn't what she said that interested detectives. It was the things she couldn't hide. The way her breath hitched when they mentioned the gun. The way her fingers curled slightly when they brought up the neighbor's testimony. The flicker of panic in her eyes when she realized Paul Solomon had stopped defending her. She had held out, but she wouldn't be able to hold out forever. The next few days were carefully orchestrated. Detectives didn't rush back in with more questions. They didn't drag her in for another round of interrogation immediately. They let her sit with it. They let her wonder what they would do next. They let her feel the isolation closing in. And while she sat in her apartment, stewing in uncertainty, they went to work tightening the case against her. Every piece of evidence was re-examined, every potential lead exhausted. The phone records had already painted a clear picture, one of obsession, of desperation, of someone who couldn't stand the idea of losing. The gun purchase had confirmed their worst suspicions. The journal had been a psychological map, a window into the mind of a woman who wanted control and couldn't accept rejection. But the final nail in the coffin? It came from Paul Solomon himself. Paul had spent weeks trying to pretend he wasn't involved, that he hadn't played a part in any of this. He had stood by Carolyn longer than he should have, had ignored the warning signs, had let himself believe that their affair had been something innocent rather than something dangerous. But now, with the case closing in, with detectives showing him the same evidence they had shown Carolyn, he had finally reached a breaking point of his own, and he told them everything. How Carolyn had pushed her way into his life, how she had refused to let go, how she had asked too many questions about Betty Jean, how she had once said, almost casually, almost like an afterthought, if she wasn't around, things would be easier. It had sounded like jealousy at the time. A frustrated woman venting about an affair that wasn't moving fast enough, about a man who wouldn't leave his wife for her. But now, knowing what they knew, it sounded like something else. It sounded like intent. With Paul finally cooperating, detectives moved fast. They secured a warrant. Carolyn Warmus wasn't just a suspect anymore. She was about to be arrested. The moment they knocked on her door, she knew. She didn't ask why they were there. She didn't argue, didn't fight. She just stood there silent as they took her in. This time the game was over, and the truth was coming. The courtroom was silent in the way only courtrooms could be. An oppressive kind of stillness, heavy with expectation, thick with the weight of a decision that would alter lives forever. The air was cold, not from the temperature, but from the collective breath-holding of those inside. On one side, Betty Jean Solomon's family sat in quiet grief, their loss still raw despite the years that had passed since the night she had been gunned down in her own home. On the other, Carolyn Warmus sat unmoving, dressed in muted colors, her expression unreadable, as if she still believed, even now, that she could will the narrative to change. But stories didn't change once the truth was uncovered. They only ended. The prosecution had spent months crafting their case, laying out every damning piece of evidence with precision. The phone records had painted a picture of an affair that had spiraled into something dangerous, something possessive. The gun purchase had proven premeditation. The journal had been the window into a mind obsessed with controlling fate, unwilling to accept rejection, willing to eliminate anything or anyone standing in the way. And then there was Paul Solomon, the man who had once been caught between two women, blinded by flattery, foolish enough to believe obsession was just love in a more intense form. He had taken the stand, his voice steady, but his guilt unmistakable. He had admitted to the affair, admitted to the signs he should have seen, admitted that he had ignored the darkness creeping into Carolyn's eyes until it was too late. He had not pulled the trigger, but he had let the situation fester, thinking it would fix itself, thinking Carolyn would move on, thinking that the weight of his choices wouldn't come crashing down. Betty Jean had paid the price for his blindness, and Carolyn had made sure of that. The defense had tried everything. They had painted Carolyn as the victim of a biased investigation, a woman who had been scorned and scapegoated, a person who had been emotionally attached but never dangerous. They tried to convince the jury that the evidence was circumstantial, that the gun was never found, that there was no confession. But evidence didn't have to be perfect to be undeniable. Carolyn's own actions had betrayed her. The neighbor who had seen her near Betty Jean's home on the night of the murder. The way she had hovered around Paul's life in the days before the crime, waiting for a moment that she knew was coming. The recorded conversations, the psychological unraveling, the obsessive writings in her journal. It wasn't a single smoking gun. It was an avalanche. And when the final arguments were made, when the jury was sent to deliberate, there was little doubt left. It didn't take long. When the verdict was read, Carolyn barely reacted. Guilty, murder in the second degree, a minimum of 25 years in prison. There was no outburst, no protest, no grand speech declaring innocence. Just silence. As if, for the first time in her life, Carolyn Warmus had finally realized that there were some things she couldn't control. Justice, when it came, was rarely as satisfying as people expected it to be. Betty Jean Solomon was still gone, her life taken in the most brutal way possible, her future erased by a woman who had convinced herself that love meant possession. Paul Solomon had to live with the knowledge that his choices had indirectly set this tragedy into motion. He had ignored the warning signs, fed into an obsession he should have walked away from, and now, no matter how many times he apologized, it would never bring his wife back. Carolyn Warmus spent decades behind bars, continuing to insist on her innocence, claiming she had been framed, claiming she had never fired the gun that ended Betty John's life. But the world had moved on without her. When she was finally released on parole, there was no one waiting for her. The life she had tried to steal for herself, Paul, his love, his attention, had long since disappeared. And in the end, she was left with nothing. The case of Carolyn Warmus wasn't just about murder. It was about the cost of obsession, about how unchecked desire could turn into something lethal, about how some people could not handle the idea of not getting what they wanted. It was about ignoring the warning signs, the small moments that, in hindsight, were flashing red lights. It was about the line between love and control, and how, when crossed, it could destroy lives. And it was about justice. Messy, imperfect, but necessary. Betty Jean Solomon had her life stolen from her by someone who believed they had the right to rewrite fate. But in the end, fate had written its own story, and Carolyn Warmus would never be able to change it. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.